executive editor of the News Journal, Delaware Online. You couldn't tell from the sign behind. Before I hand over the mic to our moderator tonight, I just wanted to thank the Red Clay School District and the students who are helping us out tonight. We can give them a hand before we go on. I was spending the day looking for a pithy quote to talk about the importance of voting in this election. And as usually happens, social media helped me out. And I saw this great photo on Twitter of a woman wearing a t-shirt that says, "The mayor in Jaws was still the mayor in Jaws 2. It's important to get out to vote." I couldn't find anything better than that, and I thought that was fabulous. So we thank everybody for being here tonight, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Matthew Albright, our moderator for tonight's evening.
Thank you very much, Mike. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us tonight. This is a great crowd, and you laughed at Mike's stupid jokes, which is always makes us happy as the employees. I'm Matthew Albright. I'm the News Journal's engagement editor, which does not mean that I'm the person you send your wedding announcements to. Please do not send your wedding announcements. Our goal tonight is to help you hear directly from the candidates for U.S. Senate about where they stand on the issues that are important to Delawareans. The questions we're going to be asking are a mix of questions submitted by readers of the News Journal. I'm sure some of you are among them. We got more than 100 questions, really good questions on a lot of topics. There's also a mix of questions from our panelists I'm going to introduce shortly. We're prioritizing questions that are about issues that we got a lot of questions about. So there were a lot of themes about healthcare and the economy and money and politics. We're going to prioritize those questions first. We ask that the audience please remain quiet while the candidates are speaking. Please hold your applause until the end of the event or until the candidates are done. We have a lot of ground to cover, and we'd like to keep interruptions to a minimum. Allow me to introduce our panel here. Scott Goss is a News Journal reporter who covers state politics and government. Caleb Owens is editor-in-chief of The Review, the University of Delaware's student newspaper. And Nichelle Polston is a Wilmington-based journalist and a board member of the ACLU of Delaware. Panelists, thank you very much for your participation. We're going to start this evening with Eugene Truono, who is a Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate. Mr. Truono's opponent in the primary, Rob Arlett, declined to participate this evening. His campaign said he had a scheduling conflict. We thought it was important that Mr. Truono still be able to talk to you guys about his views. Mr. Truono, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Let's walk through the format briefly. Mr. Truono will have 3 minutes to make an opening statement. Then our panel will ask him a series of questions. Mr. Truono will have up to 1.5 minutes to respond to each question. Mr. Truono, you are not required to take the full time for every question. We will wrap up Mr. Truono's portion of the debate with a lightning round, in which we will ask him a series of questions with yes or no answers. At the end of the lightning round, he'll get 1 minute to clarify answers he gave, and then we will wrap up with a 1 minute closing statement. With that, let's begin. Mr. Truono, please begin with your opening statement.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I want to thank the News Journal. I want to thank Callaway School of Performing Arts for hosting this event. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Gene Truono. I am not a career politician, nor do I aspire to be. I spent 30 years in the financial services industry, most recently as the Chief Compliance Officer at PayPal. I've had a wonderful, blessed life. I was able to retire early to take care of my mom, and I got to spend every day with her till the day she died. The most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life. I am running because I believe that Delaware is looking for change. So there's a couple things that I think are really important to consider. The Republican primary, the primary for both candidates, is next Thursday, September 6th. And I think there's a real distinction between me and my opponent. My opponent chose not to come tonight. My opponent chose not to pay his taxes on multiple occasions, his federal and state taxes. And so I ask him, and ask all of you, to consider how can we send someone to Washington who has not paid their federal and state taxes and make policy decisions on taxes, which I'm sure is going to be one of the issues that comes up in tonight's debate. My opponent also chose, he claims to say that he has a record. He has a record as a Sussex County councilman. And he chose to decide and vote for with the large developers and realtors in Sussex County, as opposed to choosing to look at proper ways of land use and density in Sussex County. He chooses that vote every time. So there is a choice in the Republican primary next week. I think the choice is clear. I hope you'll learn from me speaking tonight on where I stand on all the issues. I'm a principled conservative. I believe in the Constitution and states' rights. I also have had a unique opportunity working for some of the corporations that I work with around the world. At JP Morgan, I implemented their USA Patriot Act. At PayPal, I built their global anti-money laundering compliance program. I also became their chief compliance officer. I had 120 staff members all around the world, in Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Australia, Canada, Latin America, and Europe. And in those countries, we developed sanctions programs, which I think is going to be relevant. Probably have a question on sanctions, because it's an important foreign policy decision. I understand the way those laws work and how they're implemented. And I think that uniquely qualifies me over my primary opponent in terms of some of my background and experience that will be helpful for Delawareans as our role in the next U.S. Senate race. Thank you.
With that, we're going to get to questions from our panel. And the first question is from Scott Goss.
Mr. Truono, healthcare costs have been continue to grow for Delaware families. What can Congress do to make healthcare more affordable for the average family?
So my Democratic opponents are going to talk about their vision for healthcare, which is to have Medicare for all. I absolutely... I absolutely do not support that, and here's why. Medicare for all has been estimated to cost $32 trillion over the next 10 years. It's not sustainable. I talked about this when they passed the Affordable Care Act. And in the Affordable Care Act, it changed our healthcare system, and not effectively because it's failing us. Why would we take 65% of healthcare recipients who get their insurance from the private employers and disrupt that by having the federal government run that portion of our healthcare? I think we should focus on the area of the 15% that don't have healthcare insurance and work on reforming Medicare and Medicaid in order to better reform the healthcare system in this country.
The second question is going to come from Caleb.
Do you support the Second Amendment? What specific gun safety legislation, if any, do you support?
So I've been very clear on this throughout the campaign. I believe in our Constitution. Our Constitution allows for the right to people to have guns or bear arms. There are two specific cases that actually reinforce that amendment. That's the Heller decision and the McDonald decision. So I don't believe laws that are passed to ban guns are constitutional, but I also don't think that solves the problem. If we look at the issues surrounding a lot of these school shootings, it's been an issue of mental health. So I think the one way we can help stop gun violence in this country is to help fix the mental health system. We also do need to fix the next system, which is the verification system. We also need to fix the 911 system, because the child or the young adult in Miami had called out several times to 911 and no one showed up at his house. I think that's unacceptable. And lastly, one thing that every school, every church, every facility can do is a risk assessment. The federal government is passing legislation that will send dollars to the states to reinforce schools the way they want to do it, at a local level, not prescribed by the federal government. I think an assessment of each school. I actually spoke at a school that had 88 students. It was a private school in the suburbs, and they had key cards, access. I couldn't get in. That's what they decided in terms of their risk assessment. I think those types of policies would better help stop gun violence in this country.
Tell us, would you vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court? If not, who else would you like to see on the Supreme Court, and why?
Thank you. Great question. So I've been consistent on this as well. My fundamental belief is the Supreme Court should be constitutional. Supreme Court justices should be qualified by their decisions based on the Constitution and the fact that they will follow the rule of law, stare decisis. I reviewed Judge Kavanaugh's record, and I believe that he does that, and he is qualified to be a justice sitting on the Supreme Court. His decisions are consistent. Some of the media press that's been out there have been not accurate about his decisions and what he decided, and I think we should give him at least a chance and have a hearing. Every senator has the duty to consent with the president on nominations, including the Supreme Court, and I believe that every senator should at least meet with Brett Kavanaugh and determine whether he's qualified or not.
What are some of the things that you believe are not accurate that the media is reporting?
So there was a recent report that he was picked by the president to to give him cover. And the decision actually was a Minnesota Law Review article in 2009, where he indicated that he did not believe, although the case in Clinton versus Jones did allow for, under the current law, to the president to have a civil suit brought against him. And he believes that during the term of the president, and this was even related to the Paula Jones case, that during the president's term, he should not, and he called on Congress to act, which is what the Supreme Court should do, because when legislators do not follow the law, or we don't have laws that cover it, then it's the legislative branch of the government to act, not the Supreme Court.
The next question goes to Scott. What decision or policy has President Trump made that you agree with?
Excuse me. No, I didn't need the word for that. I'm just my mouth is dry. So one of the biggest things that I agree with him and I follow pretty closely is his jobs and economic development policy with the tax cuts. Now, there's been a lot of remarks made about the tax cuts, but we've seen them work effectively. We had a 4.1 GDP growth in the second quarter. The reason why we had a 4.1 GDP growth, which we were told even a couple of years ago that 2% was the new normal, was the tax cuts are actually working. And some people on the left will say that the tax cuts were for the rich. 80% of the tax cuts went to the rich and the big corporations. Well, I'll grant you that the big corporations did give money to their employees, did give stock options, and bought stock back. But they also invested in plant and equipment. And the fact that they invested in plant and equipment creates sustainable jobs and will create a sustainable growth of the GDP over the next 3 or 4 quarters at least, and maybe into next year.
Audience, please. We get that there are a lot of you in the audience who disagree with Mr. Truono, but please keep these kind of disruptions to a minimum.
Well, and we'll wait and see.
And can you give a decision that the president has made you disagree with?
I think some of his decisions on policy have, his major decisions on policy I don't agree with, but things like the issue that happened at the border, which was fixed after there was an outcry because of the policy that created the separation of children, that was a wrong decision. There's some other decisions that they've talked about in terms of policy related to gun control that I don't necessarily agree with. And I think, by and large, as a senator, you need to look at the entire policy as you make decisions on how you pass legislation.
Thank you. The next question goes to David.
What, if anything, should the federal government do about the constantly rising cost of college and growing student debt?
So I think part of the problem with college tuition is that we have created a boatload of money because of some of the programs that were created under the last administration. I think some of the things that will help reduce the cost of higher education in particular are allowing the free market system to work. And by that I mean, as we see that there are jobs, and there are a lot of jobs being created today that are allowed to, even Microsoft, Apple, Google are hiring high school students or students out of high school. We have a program here in Delaware called Zip Code Wilmington. And that program helps train disadvantaged high school youth to become coders. They don't need to go to college. They don't necessarily need a college education. So I think using the free market system in the private sector to help create jobs that don't necessarily require college education will reduce the number of people going into college and will then, ergo, reduce the cost of higher education.
Next question goes to Michelle. I'm sorry.
What is the best solution to political gridlock over immigration reform? Also, how do you balance enforcing the law with treating immigrants humanely?
So there's a lot of gridlock in Washington, not just with immigration reform. I think the problem is that both sides have not been willing to give. My view on immigration is pretty simple. I believe we need to fix the legal immigration system. There's a proposed bill called the RISE Act. And the RISE Act allows for allowing for the number of immigrants, H-1B visa and B-4 visas, seasonal workers, to come into this country based on the need for employment. And as we see the unemployment rate drop, we're going to want to be able to fluctuate that. So the way you do it, I guess we have to just work together across the aisle and determine what policies we agree on. I believe that you need to start with a basic framework and you need to come together. I spent 30 years in the financial services industry, and the 3 constituencies I dealt with were the business, which didn't want to do anything we wanted to do. The regulators who wanted us to do far more than what was required. And the consumer somehow always got stuck in the middle. I was able to bridge the gap between those three constituencies by working together, finding common ground, and making solutions. And I think we can apply that to healthcare as well as to the immigration system.
Thank you. Next question goes to Scott.
What should the federal government be doing about the opioid crisis?
So that's a great question. I think the problem with the opioid crisis is we look at it somewhat myopically. I think we have to re-look at the way we treat people for opioids. We need to have the American Medical Association set new protocols for prescribing opioids. I think there's an overprescription problem that we're aware of, and they're working on that. But the other thing that I've talked about, and some people agree and some people don't, I think the fact that illegal fentanyl flows through our southern border is a real problem, because the people who overdose usually overdose on the illegal fentanyl. And I think we have to look at the situation as a mental health crisis, as well as a prescription crisis, as well as looking at illegal drugs that come across our border. And if you don't solve all three, you're not going to solve that problem.
Next question goes to Caleb.
From produce shipping in the Port of Wilmington to agricultural sales in Sussex County, trade policy can have a major impact on Delaware. Do you think our current trade system is fair? And if not, what would you do to improve it?
So, as there's been a lot of talk about trade and tariffs that the president has been proposing against other countries, we've seen some success in this. He's negotiated at least the baseline agreement with the European Union to come to parity at zero tariff. He also negotiated to have soybeans sold in Europe as well as natural gas. He's working on a deal that actually I think there was a preliminary announcement today with Mexico for NAFTA, and then move on to Canada. They're already working with Japan, and I think that leaves China. China's our biggest trading partner. China needs us as much as we need them. And so I think if we can leverage the good negotiation skills that have occurred, and a lot of work, but they've been negotiating with the Mexicans for over a year, we can really reform trade policy to make it fair and equal for all countries, including the United States.
And then the next question goes to Michelle.
Do you believe women have the right to have an abortion? And what restrictions, if any, do you think are appropriate on abortion?
Sure. So I'm a pro-life person, and I'm proud of that. But the law that's pending in Washington is a 20-week abortion ban. It passed the House, it did not pass the Senate, it didn't have enough votes to pass. I would vote for that bill, because if you look at the law, Roe v. Wade allows for an absolute restriction on abortion, an absolute right for abortion in the first trimester. It allows the states to regulate it in the other trimesters. A 20-week abortion ban, under Roe v. Wade, it says that when a fetus is viable, there's a compelling state interest. We are only one of 7 countries, including China and North Korea, that allow for abortions after 20 weeks. And I think I would support that bill, because time has come that the acknowledgement by medical and biological science is that a fetus is viable after 20 weeks, and therefore it should not be approved.
Before we move to the lightning round, this is a series of quick yes or no questions, and then the last 2 are not yes or no questions, but they're 1 or 2 word questions. The first question is, I'll be asking the questions. Should the federal minimum wage be increased?
No.
Do you support the GOP tax bill that passed last year?
I do.
Do you support a constitutional amendment to reverse the Citizens United Court decision about money in politics?
I do not.
Do you support athletes protesting at NFL games?
I think under the First Amendment they have the right to do whatever they choose.
No answer.
Yes.
Are President Trump's tariffs a good idea?
I believe we're seeing them work. Yes.
This is not a yes or no question. What is your favorite movie?
The Wizard of Oz.
This is also not a yes or no question. What's your favorite place in Delaware?
I know, but I have to say Rehoboth. My father had 8mm film of me crawling on the beach in a diaper with the $ sign in the background.
If you would like to elaborate on any of your lightning round answers, like why you didn't pick Wilmington,
But I want Wilmington next.
feel free to take 1 minute to elaborate on any of the lightning round answers you gave.
Could you repeat them real quick?
Sure. Should the federal minimum wage be increased? Did you support the GOP tax bill? Do you support a constitutional amendment to reverse the Citizens United Court decision?
That's the one I want. So the Citizens United decision is one that I don't agree with all the big money in politics. Obviously, not being a career politician, it's really hard to raise money to run for a statewide campaign. And so, if they made parity so that big labor unions and other organizations couldn't contribute, then I think that would make it fair. But just to cut off one source of funding over another is not fair. So, career politicians have a unique advantage because they've gotten money from PACs and from corporations, and not to be able to get that money to compete would be really, I think, devastating to a campaign like ours, which has been pretty much grassroots since we began.
Thank you. And now you have a minute for your closing statement.
So for those of you who are going to go out and vote, and I hope everyone is going to go out on September 6th, and so in Delaware, as you know, it's a closed primary state. For those of you that are Republicans in here, I hope you'll go out and make a choice for me over my primary opponent, who I don't believe he made a choice not to come, not only this week, but last week at the GATA event. And I think that says volumes about his commitment to Delaware, and certainly his commitment to Newcastle County. I'm a lifelong Delawarean. I love this state. I've been very blessed my entire life. I retired early. I got to take care of my mom every day of her last year of her life. It was the best thing I ever did. And so now it's time for me to give back to Delaware. I want to help all Delawareans, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and yes, people from Wilmington, and people from Kent County, and people from Rehoboth. And actually, if you know Sussex County, it really isn't one county, it's two, because there's Eastern Sussex and Western Sussex, and they're both very, very different. So thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your support.
Mr. Truono, thank you very much.